thing that needed to be done was to find somebody to write and deliver the eulogy.
There is a man in England who has been...
A private courier left Northamptonshire at dawn, carrying a leather folder addressed directly to Buckingham Palace. Inside were sealed records from Althorp estate that Earl Charles Spencer swore he would never release. King Charles's aides tried to stop it, but the paper trail is already out. For 30 years, the palace controlled Diana's story. That silence just ended. A sealed envelope at Althorp and the Call King. Charles never wanted to take the black sedan pulled away from the gates of Althorp estate at 6 in the morning on February 3rd, 2026. Rain was falling over Northamptonshire. On the back seat sat a thick leather folder secured with a brass clasp. The driver had one stop to make. He drove straight down the M1 motorway towards central London, turning into the side entrance of Buckingham Palace before 8. A junior clerk took the delivery. He did not recognize the sender's mark at first. Attached to the leather folder was a single card signed by Earl Charles Spencer. Below his name, the Earl wrote 6 words: "For the King's eyes only, today." By 9 o'clock, the folder was lying on a mahogany desk in the private apartments. King Charles was at Highgrove House that morning. His private secretary made the call instead. He picked up the secure phone line and dialed the direct number for Sir Clive Alderton. The contents of that folder were not meant to exist. For 3 decades, palace officials believed all personal correspondence regarding Princess Diana's final years was catalogued and locked away in the royal archives at Windsor Castle. They were wrong. 2 weeks earlier, maintenance workers were clearing a damp basement room beneath the library at Althorp. They moved 3 heavy oak chests that had remained untouched since 1997. Behind those chests, tucked into a stone recess, was a metal archive box marked with blue paint. Earl Spencer opened that box himself. Inside lay dozens of handwritten notes, telephone logs, and personal diary entries. Every single page detailed interactions between the Spencer family and senior royal courtiers during the most explosive period of modern royal history. Among the papers was a 4-page handwritten letter from Diana, dated August 12, 1996. That was just 16 days before her divorce was finalized. In that letter, she named specific individuals inside the household who were actively working to isolate her from her children. Spencer did not panic. He did not call the press. He called his senior legal advisor in London and scheduled an urgent meeting at his private club in Mayfair. Word of the discovery reached the palace within 48 hours. A senior courtier attempted to defuse the situation before it escalated. He offered Earl Spencer a private meeting with the king's legal team. The proposal was simple. The palace would send a team of certified archivists to Althorp to catalog the papers quietly. The documents would then be transferred to the Crown estate under a permanent non-disclosure agreement. Earl Spencer listened to the courtier's pitch over the phone. He did not interrupt. When the courtier finished talking, Spencer gave a short, blunt answer. "These belong to my sister, not your institution." He hung up the phone. That rejection sent shockwaves through the royal household. For years, the palace relied on a quiet arrangement with the Spencer family. The unwritten deal was simple. The family kept their privacy, and the palace protected Diana's public memory. That fragile peace was built on mutual silence. Now, that silence was shattered. By sending the leather folder directly to the palace on February 3rd, Spencer was not asking for permission. He was giving a warning. The folder contained high-resolution copies of 12 specific documents from the metal box. One document was a transcript of a recorded telephone call between Earl Spencer and a senior palace official from November 1995. In that recording, Spencer explicitly warned the courtier that Diana was being manipulated by deceptive journalists. The courtier dismissed his concerns as paranoia. Another document was a private memo written by Spencer on the night of his sister's death. It detailed a heated argument with royal officials over the arrangements for her funeral parade through the streets of London. The private secretary spent 40 minutes reviewing the pages. He realized immediately that these documents contradicted decades of official statements issued by the royal press office. If these papers were released to the public, the carefully crafted narrative of how the palace handled Diana would collapse overnight. At 10:30 that morning, an emergency meeting was called inside the private secretary's office. 3 senior advisors gathered around the table. They needed to know what Spencer wanted. Was this a prelude to a tell-all book, Was he planning a public exhibition at Althorp, or was this something far more dangerous? The answer arrived via an email sent to the king's personal solicitor at noon. Spencer was not asking for money. He was not looking for a commercial deal. He gave the palace a strict 14-day deadline to correct specific historical entries in the official royal archives regarding Diana's royal status and security arrangements. If the palace refused, Spencer made his position crystal clear. He would donate the entire archive to a public educational institution in the United States, where it would be digitized and made accessible to every historian in the world. The legal team was trapped. They could not use standard Crown copyright laws to block the move. The documents were written on Spencer family stationery and discovered on private Spencer land. The legal title belonged entirely to Earl Spencer. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere turned cold. Staff members were instructed not to discuss the Althorp delivery. Phone calls between senior aides became brief and tense. King Charles was briefed on the situation at 2 o'clock that afternoon during a break from his medical treatments. He sat in his study at Highgrove, holding the phone, listening to the legal breakdown in complete silence. When his secretary finished speaking, Charles asked only one question: "Does William know about this?" The secretary hesitated before answering. The truth was even more complicated than the king realized. Prince William had not been caught off guard by the delivery. In fact, he had visited his uncle at Althorp just 6 weeks earlier, away from the sight of palace cameras. A quiet shift was taking place within the family, and the balance of power was tipping in a direction the old guard never saw coming. 30 years of holding his tongue comes to an end. September 6, 1997 remains frozen in royal history. On that cold Saturday morning, inside Westminster Abbey, Earl Spencer stepped up to the pulpit. Millions watched from across the globe. He delivered a speech that shook the palace to its foundation. He declared that his sister needed no royal title to continue generating her particular brand of magic. He pledged that her blood family would protect her sons. The public applauded. The royal family sat in stony silence. What the public never saw was the fierce battle fought behind closed doors just 24 hours earlier. On the Thursday before the funeral, senior palace aides demanded to see a copy of Spencer's text. Royal protocol dictates that all official eulogies inside the abbey must be vetted by the household. Spencer refused. He kept his draft locked inside a briefcase at his London home. On the night of September 5th, a senior advisor called Spencer's private line. The advisor warned him that any open criticism of the crown or the press would cause permanent damage to the young princes. The advisor pushed hard. He wanted specific references to the royal household reworded. Spencer held his ground. But 10 minutes before he walked down the aisle, standing backstage in the Abbey holding a pen, he made a single edit to his manuscript. He struck out 2 sentences. Those deleted lines named a specific senior courtier and a high-profile media executive. Spencer felt the phrasing was too sharp for a funeral service. He crossed them out with thick black ink and pocketed the edit. For nearly 30 years, the palace believed those cut lines were destroyed. They assumed Spencer had simply vented his frustration and let it go. They were mistaken. Spencer kept the original draft with the black crossouts intact. He filed it away in the private archives at Althorp, alongside a handwritten diary entry from that exact night. In that entry, Spencer wrote down every detail of the high-pressure phone call. He noted the name of the courtier who tried to censor him. He logged the exact time of the call and the threats made regarding his future access to his nephews. That diary entry was the beginning of a systematic project. After 1997, the palace launched a quiet public relations effort to rebuild the crown's image. Part of that strategy involved subtle leaks to British newspapers. Anonymous palace sources frequently portrayed Spencer as an unreliable, hot-headed outsider who was difficult to work with. Whenever a leak appeared in the press, Spencer did not issue public denials. Instead, he opened a leather notebook and logged it. He recorded the date of the article, the newspaper, and the specific claims made. Then he cross-referenced those claims against his private records. He kept telephone receipts, letters, and internal memos. Over 3 decades, he assembled an unbroken paper trail documenting every interaction between Althorp and Buckingham Palace. This was not done out of spite. It was built as a defensive shield. Spencer knew how the royal establishment operated. He saw how court historians rewrote difficult chapters to protect the institution. He knew that as long as his sister's contemporaries remained in power, her side of the story would be slowly minimized. By 2024, the political landscape inside the royal family began to shift. Key players from the 90s were retiring or stepping back. Newer courtiers took over day-to-day operations. These younger aides lacked the direct experience of the marriage breakdown. They treated the historical narrative as settled law. During a routine archival review at Windsor in early 2025, the palace updated its official online biographical records regarding Princess Diana. The updated entries quietly altered the timeline surrounding her security clearance in 1996. The revised text implied that Diana had voluntarily rejected royal protection officers against the strong advice of the crown. That subtle change was the tipping point. The official claim made it look as though the palace had offered total protection and Diana threw it away out of paranoia. Spencer saw the updated entry on the official royal website. He immediately retrieved Box 17 from the Althorp library. Inside, Box 17 was an original letter signed by a former Home Office official dated October 14, 1996. The letter proved the opposite of the palace's new web entry. It showed that the removal of her armed guard was framed by palace officials as an administrative consequence of her title loss, rather than a choice she freely made. Spencer realized the history was actively being rewritten under his eyes. He did not write an angry letter to the editor. He did not go on television. He called his archivist and ordered a complete inventory of every document stored in the stone basement at Althorp. It took 4 months to complete the audit. By December 2025, the inventory was complete. It contained over 400 primary sources, letters, draft statements, legal notes, and recorded phone messages spanning from 1992 to 1997. Every document was scanned, cataloged, and verified by an independent legal notary in Northampton. The notary placed an official red seal on each folder. This meant the collection was legally authenticated. It could no longer be dismissed by palace press officers as family speculation or misremembered gossip. When the audit ended, Spencer sat down in his study at Althorp. He had 2 choices. He could keep the files locked away and leave them to history, or he could force the palace to face the records directly. He chose to act. On January 10, 2026, Spencer sent a quiet letter to the senior legal director at Buckingham Palace. He did not attach the full archive. He attached a precise index listing 32 specific documents. The cover note was brief. Spencer stated that the official royal history contained deliberate inaccuracies regarding his sister's final years. He gave the palace 21 days to review the index before he took his next step. The palace legal office received the letter on a Monday morning. At first, the legal team treated the index as a routine query from a royal relative, but as the senior partner read through the itemized list, his tone changed. Item 9 on the list read, "Original unedited draft of funeral eulogy, including excise text regarding senior household personnel, dated September 5th, 1997. Item 14 read, Internal Memorandum from Royal Security Division regarding security detail modifications, signed October 1996. The legal team realized this was not a casual request. It was an exhaustive evidence file. A junior courtier was instructed to call Althorp to ask for clarification. When the courtier reached Spencer's office, he tried to adopt a diplomatic tone. He asked if the Earl was open to discussing a quiet resolution with the King's private advisors. Spencer's assistant answered with a single sentence provided directly by the Earl. "The index speaks for itself. We await your written response." The countdown had officially begun. The palace was running out of time, and they still did not know who else had seen the files. The unspoken pact between Prince William and his uncle. On December 18, 2025, an unmarked Range Rover turned into a quiet gravel driveway in Norfolk. The house belonged to a mutual family friend, sitting less than 20 miles from the Sandringham estate. Prince William stepped out of the vehicle alone. He wore a dark wool coat and a flat cap pulled low. 5 minutes later, Earl Spencer arrived in a muddy estate truck. The two men met inside a wood-paneled dining room. There were no palace aides present. No protection officers stood inside the room. They sat at a long oak table with 2 black coffee mugs between them. On the table lay a single white binder. Inside were photocopies of the 32 authenticated documents Spencer had audited weeks earlier. Spencer pushed the binder across the wood. He told his nephew straight, "I am not doing this to pull down the roof. I am doing this so nobody rewrites what happened to your mother." William did not pull away. He did not call his lawyers. He opened the binder and began to read. The relationship between William and his uncle had been carefully managed for years. Publicly, the palace kept a polite distance from the Spencer family. The press often reported that the uncle and nephew rarely spoke. The reality was far more structured. Since 2022, William and Spencer maintained a secure mobile connection. They did not discuss daily royal gossip. They talked about property management, family archives, and the long-term preservation of Diana's personal items. William understood his uncle's temperament. He knew Spencer was fierce, quick to defend his bloodline, and deeply suspicious of palace bureaucracy. As William turned the pages in the Norfolk dining room, he reached a document from May 1997. It was a record of a private conversation between Diana and her brother regarding the care of her sons if anything ever happened to her. In that record, Diana explicitly requested that her brother serve as a counterweight to the royal court's influence on the boy's upbringing. William read the passage twice. He looked up at his uncle. The tension in the room was not between uncle and nephew. The tension was between two different visions of royal history. William occupied an extraordinary position. He was the future king, pledged to defend the institution of the monarchy. But he was also Diana's eldest son, carrying the personal memory of her distress. For years, the old guard of palace courtiers treated William as their primary shield against the Spencers. They assumed William would naturally take the crown's side in any dispute over historical records. They miscalculated. William's own office at Kensington Palace was staffed by a younger generation of advisors. These modern aides operated differently from the traditionalists at Buckingham Palace. They did not view the 60s and 90s through a lens of total institutional secrecy. 2 days after the Norfolk meeting, William held a private briefing with his top private secretary at Kensington Palace. He did not order his staff to block his uncle. He instructed them to monitor the situation without taking aggressive legal action. He gave a firm directive. "We do not fight my mother's family in the press." That decision created an immediate rift between the two royal households. At Buckingham Palace, senior officials wanted to issue a preemptive legal warning to Spencer's solicitors. They argued that any release of private correspondence would set a dangerous precedent for royal privacy laws. William's team flatly refused to join the action. Without the support of the heir to the throne, the king's legal advisors were stranded. They could not launch a public legal attack against Spencer if Diana's own son refused to sign off on it. By mid-January, the internal disagreement inside the palace reached a breaking point. A senior courtier confronted William's team during a morning operations meeting. He pointed out that allowing Spencer to release historical papers would weaken the authority of the royal archives at Windsor. William's private secretary answered with a direct message from the prince. "The truth about the past does not weaken us. Hiding it does." That line ended the debate. Meanwhile, Spencer was waiting for the 21-day deadline to expire. He stayed at Althorp, continuing his daily routine. He walked the perimeter of the oval lake where his sister was laid to rest, checking on the grounds and reviewing estate accounts. He was not acting out of impulsivity. Every step was calculated with his legal team in Mayfair. On January 29, 2026, 3 days before the deadline ran out, Spencer received a handwritten letter from Sandringham. The letter was not from a courtier. It was written on personal stationery, signed by his nephew. In that note, William proposed a quiet middle ground. He asked his uncle to agree to a joint review board consisting of 2 independent historians, one chosen by Althorp, one chosen by Kensington Palace, to oversee the publication of the documents. This was a masterstroke. It bypassed the old guard courtiers entirely. It took the authority away from Buckingham Palace's press office and placed it into the hands of independent scholars. Spencer read the letter in his study. He recognized what his nephew was offering. It was a way to publish the truth without launching a public war that would drag William and Harry into another media storm. Spencer picked up his pen and wrote a single paragraph back to William. He agreed to the joint review board on one strict condition. The condition involved a specific set of audio tapes recorded in 1993 that had never been heard by anyone outside the immediate family. Those tapes held the final piece of the puzzle, and Spencer was determined that no courtier would ever lock them away again. A paper trail the palace legal team cannot erase. A heavy steel door clicked open in the basement of a law firm on Chancery Lane. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon on February 5th, 2026. Inside a climate-controlled vault sat 4 black lockboxes. 2 lawyers from the palace stood beside a lead archivist from the British Library. The head of the firm reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a key. He turned the lock on box number 3. Inside were 3 small cassette tapes marked with white masking tape. The handwritten label on the first tape read, "Althorp Studio, March 1993. These were the audio recordings Earl Spencer had mentioned to Prince William. For 33 years, their existence remained a closely guarded secret. They were recorded inside a private office at Spencer's home, during a period when Diana was seeking independent advice on her marriage and her public role. The lawyers stepped closer. The archivist put on white cotton gloves and lifted the first cassette from its plastic case. Palace legal teams spent decades operating under a specific assumption. They believed that any material involving senior members of the royal family automatically fell under royal prerogative or crown copyright laws. That legal shield had protected the household through generations of public disputes. This time, the old playbook failed. The papers and tapes stored at Althorp were created entirely on private estate grounds. They were funded by Spencer family accounts and held on private land. Crown lawyers spent 48 hours scouring property statutes and copyright legislation, looking for a loophole to seize the material. They found none. Under British property law, legal ownership rested solely with Earl Spencer. The palace had no authority to issue an injunction against documents held in a private family trust. To make matters worse for the legal team, an independent witness was present when Spencer formally signed the transfer papers. That witness was Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Diana's older sister. By standing beside her brother in the law firm's offices, Lady Sarah sent an unmistakable signal to Buckingham Palace. The Spencer family was entirely united behind the release. The palace could not play one sibling against another to force a settlement. The lawyers stared at the tape in the archivist's hands. They needed to know what was recorded on those reels. The head lawyer asked permission to play a segment. The archivist placed the cassette into a deck on the table. The tape hissed for 5 seconds. Then a clear, familiar voice filled the silent room. It was Diana, speaking in a measured, conversational tone. She was discussing specific meetings held at Kensington Palace in early 1993. In the recording, she described a conversation with a senior royal courtier. The courtier explicitly warned her that if she continued to speak to independent biographers, her travel arrangements and personal security budget would be reviewed by the Treasury. The audio was pristine. There was no background noise, no distortion, and no doubt about the speaker's identity. This single recording dismantled 30 years of official palace statements. For decades, official royal press briefings insisted that security adjustments made during the mid-90s were routine administrative measures. The tape proved those decisions were used as direct leverage during private negotiations. The palace lawyers sat down at the conference table. The atmosphere in the vault turned heavy. They realized that if this audio was played in a courtroom or released as part of a public archive, the official record maintained by the royal household would lose all credibility. The senior courtier who made those threats in 1993 was still alive, living in retirement in Gloucestershire. The legal team called the King's private secretary directly from the Chancery Lane office. They gave a stark 3-minute summary of the recording. They explained that filing a court injunction to block the tapes would trigger a public trial. Under British law, a trial would force the court to play the audio tapes in open proceedings. The press would have full access to every transcript. The palace was trapped in a legal corner of its own making. By 6 o'clock that evening, the lawyers returned to Buckingham Palace for an emergency briefing with the King's senior advisors. They laid out 2 options. Option 1 was to fight the Spencer family in the High Court, risking a public legal battle that would dominate international news for months. Option 2 was to accept Prince William's proposal for a joint review board and allow the historical records to be published with independent academic commentary. The senior advisors debated for 2 hours. During the meeting, a message arrived from Prince William's team at Kensington Palace. The message was short and direct. William would not support any legal action aimed at suppressing his mother's voice. The debate ended on the spot. Without the heir to the throne, the palace had no ground to stand on. The legal team, was ordered to stand down. The head lawyer picked up his pen and drafted a formal letter to Earl Spencer's solicitors in Mayfair. The letter confirmed that the palace would not pursue legal injunctions against the Althorp archive. In exchange, the Spencer family agreed to transfer the physical documents to the Joint Review Board before any public release. It was a total legal victory for Earl Spencer. The paper trail was secure. The audio tapes were authenticated. The palace's ability to control the narrative was broken forever. As the meeting wrapped up, the head lawyer looked at the private secretary and asked a final question. When does the review board begin its work? The secretary adjusted his papers and replied quietly, immediately. And the first files they review will open questions nobody in this building wants answered. Why the timing of Charles Spencer's disclosure scares palace aides. Most. On February 20th, 2026, a red leather dispatch box sat unopened on the desk in the private secretary's office at Buckingham Palace. Inside was the weekly royal briefing paper. Usually, this document outlined diplomatic visits, charity galas, and parliamentary schedules. On that morning, the top page contained only 3 lines regarding the newly formed Joint Review Board at Althorp. The timing of this disclosure could not have been worse for palace strategists. The royal calendar for 2026 was already under immense strain. King Charles was managing a scaled-back schedule due to ongoing medical treatments. Public appearances by senior working royals were carefully rationed. The administration was working overtime to project stability and continuity across the Commonwealth. Behind closed doors, the palace was orchestrating a multi-year PR campaign. The goal was to solidify the public standing of the King and Queen Camilla before the next major state transition. Earl Spencer's action threw a wrench directly into those gears. Public relations teams rely on controlling the news cycle. When a historical story of this magnitude breaks, it sucks all the air out of the room. Official royal announcements regarding housing initiatives or environmental funds were completely ignored by the press. Every news outlet wanted to know about the tapes in the Chancery Lane vault. What terrified palace aides most was not just the content of the files. It was the specific warning Spencer had delivered to palace officials weeks earlier. In his initial letter on January 10th, Spencer did not just demand changes to web pages. He included a blunt ultimatum regarding the upcoming publication of the official history of the late king's reign. That official history was being written by a team of court-appointed historians in Oxford. It was slated for publication in late 2027. Spencer knew how court biographies worked. They usually smoothed over internal family disputes, framing official palace decisions as necessary state policy. In his warning, Spencer stated that if the Oxford historians relied solely on the royal archives at Windsor, he would publish a side-by-side comparison using the Althorp records. He gave the palace a choice: include the verified Spencer family primary sources, or face an independent public counter-release that would highlight every contradiction. This ultimatum placed the palace communications team in a trap. If they accepted Spencer's documents into the official biography, they would have to print admissions of palace hostility toward Diana during the 90s. If they refused, they would face an unvetted archive release right in the middle of a delicate royal transition period. The old strategy of ignoring uncomfortable truths no longer worked. The palace press officers held an emergency meeting at Clarence House on the evening of February 22nd. They sat around a glass table covered with newspaper printouts and legal notes. For years, the household relied on a trusted network of royal correspondents to shape public opinion. A quick off-the-record briefing was usually enough to steer a story away from sensitive topics. This time, the correspondents were not listening to palace spin. Journalists had already verified that the Althorp audit was conducted by a reputable, independent notary. They knew the paper trail was real. The press office could not claim the documents were fabricated or misremembered. The power dynamic had flipped completely. By forced compromise, the palace press office was compelled to draft a neutral 3-paragraph statement acknowledging the work of the Joint Review Board. They dropped all language that referred to Spencer's claims as misleading. The palace had backed down. Yet, as quiet returned to the corridors of Buckingham Palace late that night, senior aides realized another problem was looming on the horizon. The Joint Review Board was scheduled to examine File Set 4 the following week. File Set 4 contained personal journals written by Diana herself during her final summer in France. And nobody inside the palace knew what she had written on her last night in Paris. The hidden legacy Diana left behind for her sons. A single wooden desk sits in the small study at Althorp House, overlooking the quiet waters of the Oval Lake. On March 4th, 2026, Earl Spencer unlocked the bottom drawer of that desk. He lifted out a small silver key attached to a blue ribbon. Inside a hidden compartment lay a dark green leather book. Its pages held handwriting from the final weeks of August 1997. This was the private journal Diana kept while traveling in the south of France. For years, rumors suggested this journal was lost during the chaos following the accident in Paris. In truth, Diana entrusted the book to her brother during her final visit to Northamptonshire in July 1997. She gave him explicit instructions. "Keep this until my boys are grown and the noise stops." Prince William knew the journal existed. He read portions of it privately on his 40th birthday in 2022. The pages did not contain bitter attacks or explosive royal scandals. Instead, Diana wrote detailed accounts of her hopes for her two sons. She mapped out her vision for their future, emphasizing independence, public service, and emotional resilience away from institutional control. What William found most striking was a short passage written on August 24th, 1997. In that entry, Diana reflected on her relationship with the royal house. She noted that her true legacy would not be defined by titles, jewelry, or palace feuds. It would be lived out through her children and how they chose to use their influence. By supporting his uncle's review board in 2026, William ensured that his mother's actual words replaced decades of palace speculation. This was not a betrayal of the crown. It was an act of historical correction. The creation of the Joint Review Board established a permanent precedent for how royal history is handled. For the first time, private family records were given equal weight alongside official state archives. The old guard of palace courtiers could no longer dictate the narrative from behind closed doors. Earl Spencer achieved what he set out to do when he stood at the altar in Westminster Abbey nearly 30 years ago. He protected his sister's memory, not with emotional speeches, but with indisputable documentary evidence. The paper trail at Althorp is now officially secured. The archives will be made available to vetted researchers and historians starting in 2028. Future generations will assess Diana's life using her own words, her own letters, and authenticated recordings. As the afternoon sun dipped below the trees at Althorp on March 4th, Earl Spencer closed the study drawer. He locked it and placed the key back into his pocket. The long fight for Diana's narrative was finally over. Her voice was preserved, her family was united, and the truth was written into history beyond the reach of any palace official. The story of the royal family is rarely written by those who live it, but Earl Charles Spencer just proved that some voices cannot be silenced forever. By securing his sister's true paper trail, he ensured that Diana's real voice will finally belong to history, not palace.